Hi everyone, get comfortable and let me take you into today's story. My mom assumed she could replace my father with her unsettling new boyfriend, Brandon, and somehow forced me to call him Dad. But she had no idea I still kept in touch with my real dad. I was 13 when she got engaged to Brandon. 5 months earlier, my dad had been convicted of manslaughter, which never made sense to me because I had always known him to be a gentle and caring person. One night, I was with him at a bar when he made a phone call, and though nothing violent happened, he came out looking terrified and confused, calling for help while the police arrived shortly after. The next time I saw him, he was behind bars and it didn't make sense. He insisted he hadn't done anything wrong, and my mom's behavior after his conviction only made me more suspicious. She immediately brought Brandon into our home and from day one insisted he was my new dad, claiming my father was dangerous and that I had to stay away for my own safety. I wasn't sure what to think at first, but months later, when she announced their engagement and told me to call Brandon Dad, I began believing my father might really be innocent. Around that time, Brandon began spending a lot of time around me, making comments that made me uncomfortable, while my mom seemed to think it was harmless. When I tried to tell her about my feelings, she dismissed me as dramatic. I began keeping another secret. I wrote letters to my dad, hiding them between my textbooks and mailing them from a friend's house after school. Dad replied through the prison email system to an account I created without my mom knowing, and those messages became my only source of comfort. Things escalated one Thursday when I came home from school to find that my mom had changed my last name on all school records to Brandon's without telling me. "You'll thank me when you're older," she said. I felt trapped and powerless. I wanted to visit my dad for his birthday, but she refused, insisting I spend time with Brandon instead. I argued and pleaded, explaining I only wanted a few minutes with my father, but my words were ignored. Even though I felt isolated and frustrated, writing to my dad kept me going, and reading his heartfelt replies gave me strength. Later, my mom discovered the letters I had been exchanging with my dad and destroyed them in the backyard, which made me feel crushed and alone. But I kept holding on to the thought of seeing him again. Every day was a struggle to act normal at home while maintaining my secret connection with my father, navigating the unfair rules of our new household, and finding small ways to preserve hope and a sense of self amidst everything happening around me. As punishment for staying in touch with my dad, my mom went so far as to remove my bedroom door from its hinges, keeping me under constant watch. Of course, Brandon immediately saw this as an opportunity to assert control. Night after night, he would stand in the doorway, silently observing me as I slept, making me feel trapped and terrified in my own home. That was the moment I felt completely broken, as if there was no safe space left for me. The very next day, I snuck off to the school library long after hours, desperate to email my dad through the DDA system. I must have poured out an hour-long rambling email that barely made sense, a flood of thoughts and emotions I couldn't control. I didn't even know what I was hoping for or if I wanted anything at all. I was just numb. Then, about 2 weeks later, a reply came. It was long, incredibly long, filled with words that reassured me, told me I was safe and that somehow everything would be okay. But one line caught my attention and confused me. "Did you check where I said?" "Check where?" I reread the email several times, puzzled, then began combing through every message my dad had ever sent me. That's when I discovered it. In one of the more recent emails, he had instructed me to go up to the attic and look behind the radiator. I remembered reading that email right after I had asked my mom for permission to visit him. But I had been too heartbroken and distracted to pay close attention, so I must have completely missed the instruction. Either way, I carefully committed it to memory and waited for the next opportunity. The one night when my mom and Brandon went out on a date. When that night came, my hands were shaking as I climbed into the attic, clutching a flashlight. Behind the radiator, exactly where my dad had said, I discovered a journal wrapped in plastic. I carefully opened it to the page he had marked, and my breath caught. It was dated weeks before my dad's arrest, written in his unmistakable handwriting, and it read, "It's been a few weeks since I caught Lauren and Brandon sneaking off into the bar. I don't know how to confront her. I was completely shocked, stunned into silence, unable to process what I was reading. I froze, completely taken aback, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sending a cold wave down my spine, making my blood run ice cold. They were back early, way earlier than I expected. Maybe the restaurant had been overcrowded, or perhaps they'd had an argument that cut the evening short. I could hear car doors slamming and my mom's heels clicking sharply on the walkway, each step echoing ominously in the quiet night. My heart raced uncontrollably as I clutched the journal to my chest, realizing I had only seconds to figure out what to do. Brandon's heavy footsteps on the stairs reached my ears next, each creak of the old wooden steps reverberating like a warning through my chest. My hands shook violently, almost causing the flashlight to slip, its beam darting wildly across the dusty attic floorboards. I pressed the journal under my shirt, feeling its cold leather against my skin, and scrambled toward the attic opening, but I wasn't fast enough. Brandon's head appeared through the hole just as I reached the ladder, his dark, intense eyes immediately locking onto mine. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable in the dim, flickering light. Then he climbed up the rest of the way, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the small opening. I instinctively pressed myself against the rough wooden wall, the journal secured tightly under my shirt against my stomach. He scanned the attic deliberately, eyes lingering over the disturbed dust floating in the air like tiny, invisible spirits, and the boxes shifted near the radiator where I had found my dad's hidden journal. His voice cut through the silence, calm but laced with a subtle menace that made my skin crawl. I tried to sound casual, telling him I was searching for my old stuffed animals from childhood, keeping my voice as steady as I could. He didn't believe me. I could see the disbelief in the tightening of his jaw, the subtle flexing of his hands at his sides. He stepped closer, and I caught the sharp scent of wine on his breath mixed with his expensive cologne, the one my mom always bragged about, but that made me feel nauseous. "You're a terrible liar, just like your father," he spat, and the words hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, yanking me toward the ladder. I had to clutch the journal with my other hand, pressing it against my body to keep it from slipping out of my shirt. At the bottom of the ladder, my mom stood, arms crossed and foot tapping impatiently, clearly annoyed. She asked why I was sneaking around like some intruder in my own home. Brandon, still holding my arm possessively, suggested we search my room, a dark glint flashing in his eyes. Panic overtook me, and I blurted out that I was only looking for my old teddy bear because I couldn't sleep without my bedroom door. The words spilled out too fast, too desperate, but my mom seemed to accept it, probably because she was exhausted and didn't want to deal with more conflict. That night, I waited until the sounds of both of them snoring reached me, Brandon's deep, rumbling snores mingling with my mom's softer, lighter ones, and I held my breath, planning my next move. The night settled into a tense, uneasy quiet, the house creaking and groaning around me as I carefully tucked the journal inside my pillowcase, feeling the rigid corners press uncomfortably against my cheek when I lay down. I couldn't risk reading any further with Brandon making his rounds every hour, his shadow inevitably appearing in my doorway like a sinister clockwork, keeping me constantly on edge. The following morning was Saturday, but it felt anything but ordinary. Mom was in the kitchen, making pancakes as if nothing had happened, humming off-key to some song playing on the radio. The forced normalcy made my stomach twist with unease. Brandon, sitting across the table, kept his eyes glued to me, following every small movement as I pushed food around my plate without appetite. I excused myself to go to the bathroom, taking the journal with me, and hid it in the toilet tank, wrapped carefully in a plastic bag I found under the sink. The cold water against my arms sent shivers through me as I maneuvered it into place, hoping it would remain unseen. Monday at school, I snuck into the computer lab during lunch, telling my friends I needed to finish an assignment. The lab was silent except for the hum of old computers and the steady ticking of the wall clock. I began taking photos of every page of the journal with my phone, angling the camera carefully to avoid the harsh glare from the fluorescent lights. My hands shook so much that several photos came out blurry, but I pressed on. The entries spanned years, Dad's familiar handwriting becoming increasingly anxious as time went on. He wrote about noticing Brandon's car parked on the street at odd hours, about Mom acting distant and secretive. One entry described finding a motel receipt hidden in Mom's purse while he was looking for gum. Another recounted Brandon showing up at the bar during Dad's shifts, lurking in a corner booth like a predator silently observing its prey. I uploaded every photo to a cloud account I had created under a fake name, my heart pounding as the progress bar slowly filled, and then I deleted the photos from my phone, double-checking that no trace remained. I knew Brandon might snoop. His intrusions into my things had become more frequent. That afternoon, when I returned home, he was already in my room, sitting on my bed as if he owned the space. He had gone through everything. Drawers were overturned, clothes scattered across the floor like autumn leaves, my mattress flipped and box spring exposed, even my old jewelry box emptied, the tangled necklaces and friendship bracelets lying in disarray. His voice was dangerously low as he asked where it was. I tried to look confused, pretending not to understand what he meant. But he grabbed my shoulders and shook me, teeth clattering together, and said he knew I had discovered something in the attic, that he wasn't foolish enough to miss it. Just then, Mom came home, her keys jingling as she called out a cheerful, "Hello," surveying the chaos in my room with raised eyebrows. Brandon, in an instant, shifted his entire demeanor, smoothly lying, claiming he was simply helping me reorganize my things, his tone calm and practiced, hiding the menace that had just been in his eyes. Brandon smoothly lied about the state of my messy room, claiming I had asked for his help, flashing that fake, insincere smile that never touched his cold, calculating eyes. As usual, Mom believed him without question, probably because it was easier than probing for the truth. That evening at dinner, Brandon announced that they were moving up the wedding, changing it from next year to next month. He said he couldn't wait any longer to make our family official. Mom squealed with delight, clapping her hands like a little girl at a birthday party. I felt a wave of nausea, the chicken on my plate suddenly gray and unappetizing, the joy in the room making my stomach twist. Over the following weeks, Brandon's surveillance intensified. He installed a camera in the hallway, aimed directly at where my bedroom door had once been, the red blinking light glaring like a malevolent eye. He began driving me to and from school, no longer allowing me to take the bus with my friends. He'd sit in the parking lot, engine idling, meticulously watching anyone who even spoke to me. At night, he confiscated my phone, leaving it on his nightstand, completely out of my reach. Despite everything, I kept pushing forward during the day, printing pages from my dad's journal at school and hiding them in my locker, taped behind old textbooks. I desperately needed help but had no one I could trust. Teachers seemed oblivious, and friends wouldn't understand the danger I was in. Then, I remembered Uncle Henry, my dad's best friend since high school. He was the kind of man who showed up when help was needed without being asked. Always reliable. Until Dad's arrest, they had been inseparable. But Mom had forbidden any contact afterward, claiming Henry was a bad influence who encouraged Dad's violent tendencies. I knew that was a lie. Uncle Henry was kind, smelled faintly of sawdust from construction work, and always carried butterscotch candies in his pockets. He had 3 kids of his own, twin boys and a little girl who affectionately called me her big cousin. I found his phone number in an old, forgotten address book tucked away in the kitchen junk drawer beneath expired coupons and dead batteries. Using the payphone outside the school during PE, the cold metal pressing against my ear, I told the teacher I was feeling sick and needed some air, clutching my stomach to make it convincing. Uncle Henry picked up on the 3rd ring, and when I told him who I was, his gruff voice softened. I poured out my words in a rush, stumbling over myself, explaining that Dad was innocent, that I had evidence, and that I needed his help. He instructed me to slow down, to breathe, and then agreed to meet me at the public library after school the next day, promising to cover for me if Mom asked where I had gone. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope that someone actually understood and could help. Brandon, of course, was suspicious when I said I needed to stay late for a group project, grilling me about who was in the group, what the assignment entailed, and which teacher had given it. But my history teacher backed me up when he called to check, probably irritated at being disturbed during her planning period. I practically ran to the library, my heart racing with a mix of fear and relief. My backpack bounced against my spine as I practically sprinted across the library parking lot. Uncle Henry was waiting in his old pickup truck, The faded red paint dull but clean, the engine humming softly. He looked older than I remembered, more gray in his beard and deeper lines etched around his eyes, carrying the weight of years and worry. I quickly showed him the photos of the journal entries on my phone, swiping through them nervously. With each page he saw, his face grew darker, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I always knew something didn't add up about your dad's arrest," he muttered, his voice low but steady. The story never made sense. Too many holes, too convenient. He asked if I still had the original journal, and when I explained where I had hidden it, he nodded approvingly. "We need more than just your dad's suspicions," he said. "We need solid evidence, witnesses, something that actually proves what happened." He had contacts, people who had been at the bar that night, who might remember details the police had overlooked or ignored. Over the next 2 weeks, I met Uncle Henry at the library 3 more times. Each meeting felt like a scene from a spy movie, checking over my shoulder, taking different routes to avoid attention. He tracked down Edward, who had been working security that night. Edward was a big man with kind eyes who remembered every detail. He confirmed seeing Brandon there, which contradicted Brandon's statement to the police that he had been home all evening watching TV. Edward had seen Brandon enter the bathroom just before my dad, maybe 30 seconds before the incident. But he had been too afraid to speak up after Dad was swiftly arrested, terrified of Brandon and his far-reaching connections. Uncle Henry also found Caroline, the bartender that night, a woman with curly red hair and a sharp memory for faces. She explained that Brandon had been frequenting the bar for weeks before the incident, always asking about Dad's schedule under the guise of friendliness. She thought it odd at the time, but dismissed it. That night, she remembered seeing Brandon order a whiskey neat and then vanish for a short time before the body was discovered. She had been the one to call 911, her hands trembling so much she could barely dial. The major breakthrough came when Uncle Henry spoke with Brian, the bar manager. Brian was an older man, having run the place for 2 decades. He mentioned they had upgraded their security system a month before the incident. The police had only seized footage from the main cameras, but there was a secondary system covering the hallway to the bathrooms. Brian had still kept those files on an old hard drive tucked away in his office, forgotten beneath piles of invoices and paperwork. We met at Brian's house to review the footage, the air thick with the smell of cigarettes and stale coffee. My stomach twisted into knots as he connected the hard drive to his laptop. The timestamp lit up the screen, 9:47 p.m. Brandon entered the bathroom, walking casually as if he had every right to be there, unaware that this footage would ultimately tell the truth. Brandon moved through the bathroom as if he had all the time in the world, completely unaware that the camera would capture everything. Dad entered at 9:52 p.m., likely just needing to use the restroom after his long shift, exhausted and unaware of the danger waiting. Brandon came out at 9:51 p.m., checking his watch, smoothing down his shirt, completely composed. Then Dad emerged at 9:53 p.m., covered in blood, screaming for help, his face frozen in horror and disbelief. The sequence was undeniable. Brandon had 4 full minutes alone in that bathroom, more than enough time to set up a frame, make a call, and stage the whole scene. Uncle Henry copied the footage meticulously onto multiple USB drives, his hands steady and precise, every movement calculated. "We have to be careful," he warned. "We can't just run to the police." Brandon might have friends on the force, favors owed. We need an airtight case first. He instructed me to act normal at home, to give nothing away, to pretend nothing had changed. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. But Brandon seemed to sense that something was off. Maybe I wasn't convincing enough. Maybe he was just hyper-aware. His aggression escalated. One night, he came into my room and sat heavily on my bed, the mattress groaning under his weight, the hallway camera unable to capture him from that angle. He told me he knew I had been sneaking around with Uncle Henry, that someone had probably spotted us at the library, likely one of his ever-present associates. He casually threatened that if I didn't stop, Mom could get hurt, listing accidents as if they were ordinary events. People fall downstairs, car brakes fail, gas leaks happen, and all said in a calm, almost casual tone like discussing the weather. The chill of the threat settled in my chest like a cold stone, paralyzing me. But I forced myself to breathe steadily and remain calm. At our next meeting, I whispered everything to Uncle Henry, even though we were alone, terrified of anyone overhearing. He insisted we had to act faster. He had been in touch with Dad's lawyer, sharing our findings. The lawyer was cautious but encouraged, insisting that we needed the original journal to prove the photos weren't doctored, to solidify the evidence. I promised I would get it, though the thought made my stomach churn. That night, I waited until 3 a.m., the red numbers on the clock ticking agonizingly slowly, then crept barefoot to the bathroom, careful not to make a sound. I retrieved the journal from the toilet tank, the plastic still intact, keeping Dad's words safe and dry. I tucked it into my backpack, zipping it into the inner pocket for school. But as I stepped out, Brandon was standing in the hallway like a dark apparition, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. I stammered that I felt sick, clutching my stomach, and he studied me silently for a long moment before allowing me to pass. His gaze followed me all the way back to my room. The next morning, my backpack was missing. I found it in the kitchen, emptied, its contents spread across the table. Brandon sat there, a menacing presence, surveying the scattered papers and belongings as if daring me to protest. Brandon sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the journal in front of him with exaggerated interest, as if performing for an audience. Mom hovered beside him, her face pale, eyes wide, clearly confused. Brandon had spun a story, telling her I'd been writing disturbing fantasy stories about him, implying I was unwell and needed intervention. He pointed to specific entries, his voice calm but sharp. "Look at this. See how she's copying your husband's handwriting? Notice how she writes about you and me together? This isn't innocent. This is her sick obsession trying to break us apart." Mom's confusion quickly twisted into anger. Her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes narrowing as Brandon wove his web of lies with just enough truth to make them sound plausible. Mom swallowed it all, nodding as if hypnotized by his manipulation. She told me she was deeply disappointed, that inventing lies about Brandon was sick, that she had expected me to cope with Dad's absence in a healthier way. I tried to protest, to explain that it was Dad's journal, but she wouldn't hear me. Her expression hardened. She accused me of forging Dad's handwriting to frame Brandon because I couldn't accept him as my new father. She said I needed therapy, or perhaps even a special boarding school for troubled teens. Brandon suggested that his cousin ran one far away in another state. Extremely strict, isolated, designed to fix children who lied or caused trouble. The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine, the room seeming to close in around me, spinning slightly as panic rose. That day at school, at lunch, I spotted Uncle Henry's old truck in the parking lot. I ran to it, climbing in and letting myself break down, tears flowing as I explained everything that had happened. He calmed me, reassuring me that we still had the footage. But when I got home that afternoon, terror hit again. My phone was gone from my backpack. Brandon had taken it. He rifled through everything and discovered my cloud account, guessing the password in only 3 tries. I was forced to watch as he deleted every single photo of the journal, his fingers stabbing at the screen with cruel satisfaction. He said that Uncle Henry's copies wouldn't matter without the original journal to verify them, that the photos alone could be claimed as doctored, that any lawyer could argue they were falsified. The bar footage was different. It came from a security system with timestamps that were harder to dispute. But my father's handwriting and the photos of the journal? Too easy to contest. That night, Mom announced that I was leaving for boarding school on Monday, a special place to help me deal with my supposed delusions about Brandon. She had already called ahead. They were expecting me. The school was 1,000 miles away, deep in the mountains with no phones allowed and no contact with the outside world for the first 6 months, meant to isolate me completely. I realized then that this was Brandon's plan, to silence me forever without any overt action, to make me vanish quietly. But I found a chance. Saturday morning, while Mom was at the grocery store and Brandon was in the shower, I quietly eased the front door open, listening to the water running and praying no one heard me. I ran as fast as I could to Ashley's house and used her phone to call Uncle Henry. Ashley's mom was at work, and Ashley didn't hesitate to cover for me, hiding me long enough for me to start taking action. Bless her for that small but vital mercy. I told Uncle Henry everything about the boarding school threat, my voice shaking as I explained how Brandon was planning to ship me off 1,000 miles away to a place with no contact, no phones, complete isolation. He told me to pack a bag immediately and meet him at the library within an hour. But when I returned home, terror hit me. Brandon was standing on the front steps, hair still damp from the shower, eyes dark with rage. He had noticed I was gone. Without a word, he grabbed me by my hair, the pain searing through my scalp, and dragged me inside. Mom hadn't returned yet. He slammed me against the wall hard enough to knock a picture frame to the floor, glass shattering, and shouted that I had ruined everything. He raged about how he'd worked too hard to let a rebellious kid ruin his plans. He revealed the depths of his scheme, saying Dad deserved to rot in prison and that he'd been orchestrating this setup for months before that night at the bar. He bragged about manipulating Mom, exploiting her loneliness and craving for attention while Dad had been working extra shifts to keep the mortgage afloat. I demanded to know why he had called that man in the bathroom, needing him to confess it aloud. Brandon laughed, a cruel, grating sound that made my blood run cold. He explained that the man had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Brandon had gone in to plant a bloody knife he had prepared in advance, one that would have had Dad's fingerprints from a kitchen mishap at home. But the man saw him and started questioning him, getting too close. Brandon admitted he had to silence him quickly and violently, using that same knife. Then, when Dad entered the bathroom minutes later to help, the scene was perfect. The blood fresh, Dad's hands unintentionally smearing it as he tried to assist the victim. In the chaos, Brandon pocketed the real murder weapon and left a different prepped knife at the scene, one that wouldn't trace back to him. I had been recording everything on Ashley's phone, hidden in my pocket, the record button already pressed before I even stepped inside. Brandon didn't notice, too absorbed in boasting about how clever he was, how he had worn gloves, studied the bar's schedule for weeks, and how marrying Mom after Dad was out of the picture was purely strategic. He spoke about her life insurance, my potential Social Security value, suggesting that accidents could conveniently remove obstacles, maybe a car crash, a fall, or even Mom taking too many pills in despair. And then Mom walked in. She'd returned early because she had forgotten her wallet. She had heard everything. Her face went pale as paper. Groceries slipped from her hands, oranges rolling across the kitchen floor. Brandon's eyes widened as he realized his mistake, scrambling to backtrack, insisting I had made him angry, that he didn't mean what he just said, claiming he was only trying to scare me straight. But Mom had heard enough. The veil lifted. Brandon stepped toward her, but she moved back, one hand reaching behind her for safety. She told him to leave. He mocked her, calling her reaction exaggerated, dismissing her threats. But she held her ground, steady and resolute, gripping a kitchen knife from the block, warning him to leave or she'd call the police. Brandon laughed again, attempting to intimidate her, claiming she wouldn't dare, fearing scandal and shame, worried about what the neighbors would think. But Mom's hand remained steady, unwavering as she held the knife firm, ready to defend herself and me. That small but vital mercy. For the first time in months, I saw the mother I had known. The one who used to protect me from nightmares. The one who kissed scraped knees and made the world seem safe. She stood firm, knife in hand, and Brandon realized she was serious. The mask he had worn for so long finally dropped completely, his smug confidence cracking. He grabbed his keys and wallet from the counter, but before leaving, he spun toward Mom with a sneer, warning her that this wasn't over. He reminded her of secrets, whispered about past affairs before Dad, hinted at money she had taken from Dad's savings to cover her own debts, threatening that if she went to the police, he would ruin her reputation completely. Then he stormed out, slamming the door with such force that the windows rattled and pictures fell to the floor. Mom collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking in waves of grief and fear. I knelt beside her, showing her the recording on Ashley's phone. She watched Brandon's confession unfold again, her face crumpling further with each word, murmuring apologies, calling herself stupid, admitting she had failed both Dad and me. I insisted we call the police immediately, but she was terrified of his threats, afraid of losing everything. I called Uncle Henry, who arrived within minutes, carrying the bar footage on a USB drive. We sat Mom at the kitchen table and laid out all the evidence: the journal entries I had preserved, screenshots, the bar security footage detailing Brandon's movements, and notarized witness statements Henry had collected. Mom was overwhelmed, her stomach turning as she realized she had been living with Dad's true attacker for months, even planning a wedding with him. Slowly, she agreed to call the authorities. 2 detectives arrived to take our statements. They were professional yet compassionate, offering Mom tissues and speaking gently to me, reviewing the confession recording multiple times. They scrutinized the bar footage on our laptop, handled the journal carefully with gloves, and absorbed every piece of evidence Henry had compiled. One detective admitted that they had always had doubts about Dad's case. The forensics had never fully added up, but pressure to close it had been immense. Brandon's confession filled every missing piece. That very night, an arrest warrant was issued, but Brandon had vanished. His apartment was stripped clean, his car gone. The police assured us not to worry, promising they would locate him and stationed a patrol car outside our house for security. Mom and I barely slept, barricading the front door with the couch and keeping all the lights on, jumping at every sound. The next morning, Uncle Henry called with news from his construction buddies. Brandon had been spotted at a motel 2 towns over, attempting to pay cash for a room. The police moved fast, and by noon they had him in custody. He tried to escape but didn't get far. In his car, they found evidence linking him directly to the original murder weapon, the proof that tied him beyond any doubt to the crime. The actual knife had been kept all these years, hidden like some twisted trophy in a locked box in Brandon's trunk. The knife left at the crime scene had been a fake, a decoy, but the real one still bore traces of the victim's blood in the small crevices of its handle. At first, Brandon tried to twist the story, claiming, "I faked that recording with AI. Mom is lying because she feels guilty about Dad." But the mountain of evidence was undeniable. The bar footage clearly showed him entering the bathroom that night. When the forensics tested the real murder weapon, his fingerprints were all over it. Every mismatch that had confused investigators about Dad now made perfect sense when applied to Brandon. Even the angle and depth of the wounds corresponded to Brandon's height and reach, not Dad's. Cornered by proof, Brandon finally cracked. He confessed everything, detailing how he had meticulously planned the entire scheme, framed Dad, manipulated Mom, and even revealing other crimes in other states. Other innocent victims blamed for things they hadn't done. Detectives described him as a serial predator, someone who had eluded justice for years, constantly moving, targeting vulnerable women and children. Dad's lawyer filed an emergency appeal with all the new evidence. The judge reviewed it thoroughly and ordered Dad's immediate release. After 8 long months imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, Dad was finally coming home. Mom and I drove to the prison, the car silent except for the soft hum of the radio. Mom kept crying quietly, dabbing at her eyes with tissues. I didn't know what to say, my throat tight with pent-up emotion. When the gates opened and Dad emerged, he looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner, older, gray streaking through his hair, but his eyes immediately lit up when he saw me. I ran to him, hugging him tighter than I had ever hugged anyone in my life. He smelled of industrial soap and sorrow, but he was still my dad. He held me close, whispering into my hair that he had missed me endlessly, that he had never stopped believing I'd discover the truth. Mom lingered, unsure, twisting her hands nervously. Dad glanced at her for a long, quiet moment, then told her they would talk later. Right now, all he wanted was to go home. The ride back was calm, only broken by Dad's gentle questions. How's school? Have you grown taller? Is your favorite restaurant still open? Simple, everyday questions that felt anything but normal after all we had endured. When we got home, Dad paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, memorizing every detail. The house felt different without Brandon's belongings scattered everywhere. Mom had cleared out everything he had touched, leaving empty spaces on shelves and walls like scars from his presence. Dad walked slowly through each room, fingers brushing over furniture, picking up picture frames Mom hadn't yet replaced, soaking in the normalcy we had lost. That first night back, the house was filled with cautious hope, quiet laughter, and the gentle comfort of being together again. A sense of safety returning to our lives for the first time in months. The first few nights back were incredibly awkward. Dad insisted on sleeping on the couch, even though Mom offered him their old bedroom. I kept hearing him moving around at odd hours, especially around 3 a.m., probably unable to sleep after months locked in a cell. One night I found him in the kitchen, making coffee with trembling hands, the steam rising in the dim light. We sat together at the table in almost complete silence until he finally asked if I was truly okay. Really okay. And I told him everything. About Brandon, about the fear, the secrets, and all the manipulation. He listened quietly, jaw tightening with each detail, eyes darkening as he processed the horror of what had happened. When I finished, he quietly said he was sorry he hadn't been able to protect me, and I told him it wasn't his fault, that I knew he never could have predicted this. The following days blurred together with lawyers and endless paperwork. Dad's attorney was working on having his record fully cleared, not just overturned, and there was even talk of compensation for the wrongful imprisonment. But Dad brushed it off. He didn't care about money. All he wanted was to reclaim his life. Mom hovered around him constantly, trying to engage, but he wasn't ready. He answered her questions with curt, one-word responses and made excuses to leave rooms whenever she lingered. Brandon's trial was scheduled for 6 months out. The prosecutor made it clear that with his full confession and the mountain of evidence, he would likely face life without parole. They had already linked him to 3 other murders across different states, all following a disturbing pattern. Frame someone close to the victim, then ingratiate himself with the grieving family. The detective remarked that we were lucky his other victims hadn't survived to tell the truth themselves. Returning to school felt surreal. Kids whispered when I walked by. Everyone seemed to know the story about Brandon and Dad by now. Ashley stayed loyal, along with a handful of friends who truly mattered. My teachers treated me with extra kindness, which only made me feel more out of place. I didn't want pity. I wanted normal, but normal seemed irretrievably gone. Dad began working construction with Uncle Henry, finding solace in physical labor, dirt and sweat helping to clear his mind. He returned home exhausted but calmer, and he was seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma from wrongful convictions. Dad didn't discuss the sessions much, but I could tell they were helping. He no longer flinched at every loud noise, no longer obsessively checked locks. Mom moved out 2 weeks later, renting a small apartment across town to figure herself out. Honestly, I felt relieved. The tension whenever Dad and Mom were in the same room had been suffocating. She had betrayed him in the worst possible way, even if Brandon had manipulated her. Some betrayals leave scars that never fully heal. Mom occasionally asked if I wanted to stay with her sometimes, but I refused. I needed to be with Dad. Divorce papers came a month later. Dad signed them without reading, just wanting closure. Mom gave him everything. The house, the car, full custody of me. Her guilt seemed to consume her, and she started seeing a therapist as well, trying to understand how she had been so blind for so long. I felt pity for her at times, but then I'd remember everything Brandon had done, everything that had almost destroyed us, and my sympathy faltered. The memory of Mom siding with Brandon over Dad lingered like a shadow, and I knew that any sympathy I might have felt for her would never last. Uncle Henry quickly became a fixture in our lives again. Weekends were filled with the smell of barbecue and the laughter of his kids. His 8-year-old twins, Elijah and John, were fascinated by Dad, completely indifferent to his past. They just loved that he could throw a football and tell the funniest stories. His daughter Deborah, the same age as me, became an instant friend. She understood what it felt like to have your world turned upside down. Her own mother had left when she was 10. 3 months after Dad's release, I faced my first pretrial hearing. The prosecutor explained that my testimony could prevent Brandon from claiming insanity or coercion. I wore my best dress, the blue one Dad had given me for my birthday 2 years prior, and felt my hands trembling as I swore to tell the truth. Brandon sat at the defense table in his orange jumpsuit, smaller somehow, like the weight of everything was pressing down on him. He tried to meet my eyes, but I refused, staring straight ahead. I recounted every detail: the threats, the unwelcome touching, the night at the hotel. When I spoke about discovering Dad's journal, the judge had to call a brief recess because I broke down in tears. Dad couldn't attend the courtroom due to potential future testimony, but Uncle Henry was there, giving me a thumbs up from the gallery, silently reassuring me I could do this. Brandon's lawyer attempted to portray me as a confused child, suggesting I might have misinterpreted his intentions. I held my composure and recounted everything precisely as it had happened. The prosecutor played the recording from Ashley's phone, and I watched Brandon's face drain of color. His lawyer immediately suggested a plea deal, 25 years to life instead of life without parole. The prosecutor refused, saying, "Absolutely not." Afterward, reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, shouting questions about forgiveness and moving on. Dad shielded me with his body as we pushed through the crowd to Uncle Henry's truck. There was nothing to say that could make them understand. This wasn't a story for headlines. It was our life. Mom began sending letters, long, rambling apologies about how she had failed as a mother and how she should have seen the warning signs. I read a few lines, then tossed them aside, unopened. Dad suggested that one day I might find it in my heart to forgive her, not for her sake, but for my own peace. But I wasn't ready. Some things I realized might never be forgivable. Brandon's actual trial was merciless. Families of his other victims were brought in, detailing the repeated pattern of his crimes. One woman from Arizona testified that after her husband's suspicious death, Brandon had pursued her, and she had sensed something was wrong and ended the relationship, probably saving her own life in the process. Another family from Nevada came forward to share their story about their son, who had been serving time for a murder that bore an uncanny resemblance to the case my dad had been accused of. The details chillingly similar in every way. The prosecutor announced they would be reopening that case as well, hoping to uncover the truth that had been buried for so long. On the third day of the trial, Dad took the stand. He wore his only suit, the one from their wedding, carefully preserved for reasons no one could quite understand. As he spoke, his words painted a vivid picture of finding the body, of his desperate attempts to help, and of the utter confusion that consumed him when the authorities had taken him into custody. He recounted the long, lonely days in prison, the birthdays he missed, the letters he wrote that I would never get to see. And his voice cracked as he spoke about the day I was born, how he had promised to protect me and yet felt he had utterly failed. Brandon was called to the stand on the 5th day, against the advice of his lawyer. He attempted to portray himself as a victim, claiming that the man in the bathroom had attacked him first, but under relentless cross-examination, his lies began to crumble. He contradicted himself repeatedly, his composure slipping as anger flared across his face, revealing the true man behind the mask. When the prosecutor asked about his intentions for me and Mom, he refused to answer, and even his own lawyer appeared defeated, shoulders slumped in frustration. The jury deliberated for 2 long hours, and when the verdict came, it was guilty on all counts: murder, conspiracy, fraud, and attempted assault on a minor, with additional charges layered on. The judge handed down consecutive life sentences without parole for every crime. Brandon showed no visible reaction, staring blankly at the table, and when they led him out of the courtroom, he glanced at me one final time. I held his gaze firmly, making sure he understood that he had not broken me, that I had survived, and that we had won. Later, Dad and I went to his favorite little Mexican restaurant, the one that still had his photo hanging on the wall from when he had been a regular. The owner greeted him warmly, gave him a hug, and said the meal was on the house. We ate quietly, comfortable in the silence, exhausted yet relieved. The nightmare was finally over. Brandon would spend the rest of his life in prison, and we could begin the slow process of rebuilding our lives. The following week, Mom came to the house, hoping to reconcile, to apologize once more, maybe even suggesting family counseling. But Dad refused to let her inside, speaking through the screen door with unwavering firmness. that bridge had burned. She had to accept her choices, and we had to move forward without her. She cried and pleaded, but Dad remained steadfast. I watched from the stairs, detached, knowing that she had chosen her path and now had to live with it. Around this time, I began seeing a therapist, Dr. Cheryl, a specialist in trauma, who helped me process everything, who reassured me that none of it had been my fault and that I had been incredibly brave throughout. Some days I believed her completely. Others I doubted myself. But gradually, the nightmares that had haunted my sleep began to fade. I stopped checking locks compulsively, stopped flinching when someone walked behind me. Progress came slowly, in small, deliberate steps. Dad and I rebuilt our daily routines together. Sunday breakfasts at the local diner, midweek movie nights, Saturdays helping Uncle Henry with his various construction projects. We started talking more than we ever had before, about school, friends, future plans, life in general. He helped me with homework, even though math had never been his strong suit, and he attended every school event, cheering me on proudly. A constant presence I had feared I'd lost forever. The house was loud with laughter at my barely passable clarinet performances, the sound of Dad cheering me on filling the rooms as we relearned what it meant to be a family again, just the two of us slowly finding our rhythm. About 6 months after the trial, Dad met someone new. Caroline, the bartender who had testified, began visiting more frequently. At first, it was just casual friendship, a comforting presence, but over time it became something deeper. She made Dad genuinely laugh, the kind of laugh that had been absent for far too long, not the forced smiles he had been managing during those dark months. I liked her immediately. She didn't try to replace Mom or act like she was stepping into that role. She treated me like a person, like someone whose experiences and opinions mattered. She would bring takeout and we'd watch ridiculous movies together, poking fun at plot holes and cheesy acting, the kind of easy, everyday fun that had been missing for so long. Dad's smiles became more frequent, more authentic whenever she was around. Mom eventually stopped trying to contact us. I heard from Ashley's mom that she had moved to another state, attempting to start over somewhere nobody knew the story of her mistakes. Part of me silently wished her well, hoped she could find peace. Another part of me didn't care. She had been so easily fooled, so quick to move on and replace Dad in her own mind. Maybe Brandon had seen that weakness in her from the very beginning. Maybe that was why our family became his target, chosen carefully to destroy. A year after everything, Dad received a settlement from the state for his wrongful imprisonment. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to pay off the house and set aside some money for my college. He bought a new truck, took a long overdue vacation in the mountains, and finally allowed himself to start living again. He kept working in construction, though, saying he appreciated the honesty of it. Either you built something right, or you didn't. There was no room for lies, manipulation, or shortcuts. I turned 15 that spring, and Dad threw a big, exuberant party, likely overcompensating for all the birthdays he had missed in prison. Uncle Henry's family came. Caroline was there. Even a few kids from school showed up. We had a bounce house, absurd for teenagers, but nobody seemed to mind. The laughter and chaos blending into a perfect snapshot of normalcy. Dad manned the grill, flipping burgers while recounting embarrassing stories from when I was little. For a few golden hours, it felt like we were a normal family, just living a normal day, forgetting the darkness that had shadowed us for so long. Later that night, after everyone had left, Dad and I stayed behind to clean up the yard, our movements slow and unhurried, comfortable in silence. He pulled me into a hug, thanking me for believing in him, for never losing faith. I told him I had always known he was innocent, that he had never been capable of hurting anyone. We both cried quietly, but these were the healing kind of tears, the ones that stitched us back together. Life gradually returned to its rhythm. I made honor roll, started dating a kind boy named Rory from my chemistry class. Dad joked about keeping his shotgun nearby whenever Rory came over, mostly teasing, his protective instincts still intact but tempered with humor. Caroline moved in a year later, bringing her cat, Mr. Whiskers, who promptly claimed Dad's favorite chair as his own. Our little household became an unconventional family, stitched together by shared trauma but strengthened by choice, trust, and love. Brandon died in prison 2 years later, a heart attack according to the official letter. He was 43. I felt nothing when I read the news, simply closed the envelope and returned to my homework. Dad asked if I was okay, and I simply said, "Yeah, I really am." Brandon had been dead to me since the moment he was sentenced. His physical death meant nothing more than the paperwork confirming it. Mom sent a card for my 18th birthday. The message brief, unsigned beyond a single line. Love, Mom. No further explanation, no attempt to reconnect, just a quiet acknowledgement from someone who had long since chosen her own path. I still had the card. The one with Mom's address, tucked away in my desk drawer among other things I hadn't been able to throw away. A quiet reminder of the past. Dad had said maybe someday I'd want to reach out. Maybe try to find her, to make some sort of peace. But maybe he was right. And maybe some bridges were meant to stay burned forever. Life moved on. I got into college on a full scholarship, planning to study criminal justice, thinking maybe one day I could become a lawyer and help other families torn apart by lies and deceit the way ours had been. Dad cried at my graduation, proud tears that embarrassed me in front of the entire auditorium, and Caroline captured 1 million pictures, her camera clicking nonstop while Uncle Henry's family cheered loudly from the bleachers, a chosen family who had stood by me when the world had fallen apart. The night before I left for college, Dad and I sat together on the porch swing, fireflies flickering around us in the warm summer air. He told me how proud he was, how he had watched me grow into an incredible young woman despite everything we had endured. And I told him I loved him, that he was the best father anyone could ever hope for. We sat in silence after that, the kind of comfortable silence that didn't need words, knowing we had survived the worst, unimaginable ordeal and somehow come out stronger on the other side. Looking back now, I sometimes catch myself imagining what might have happened if I hadn't found Dad's journal that night. If Brandon had succeeded in his plan to send me away. If Mom had married him. If Dad had remained in prison thinking nobody had ever cared. But I had found the journal. I had fought back. And sometimes that is all you can do. Fight for the truth and hope that someone, somewhere, is listening. In our case, finally, someone had heard. Someone had believed, and the justice we'd longed for had finally arrived.